To Industrial Engineering 537, Large-Scale Systems. By now, you should be well into thinking about the class project. The intent is for you to have you focus essentially exclusively on two things at this point. One is learning systems dynamics, and the second is developing your class project. I've given a couple of lectures or segments and a couple of lectures on the class project, so hopefully at this time you're well aware of what it entails and what your expected deliverables are. If you have any questions at all on the class project, now's the time to ask. So send me some email, and I'll respond to those as quickly as I can. You've heard the expression time is of the essence, and that's clearly the case at this point. We have, by the time you're viewing this, should have of the order of about 3 weeks left in the semester in order to complete the class project. And as I mentioned in a couple of the times I've referred to this, you should think in terms of some allocation of your time management, if you will, for the next 3 weeks, and that means blocking some time to spend on the class project in addition to learning system dynamics. And they are presumably connected if you elect to choose system dynamics as one of your two modeling tools. Not required, but I do encourage it. So with that, let's get into system dynamics. The founder of System Dynamics, a gentleman named J. Forrester. There's a picture of him in his earlier years, actually. He's a professor at, he started this at MIT. He invented random access magnetic core memory during the very first wave of the digital computers. And he's most known today, frankly, by his work in system dynamics, which is the analysis of the behavior of systems. Jay is currently still actively engaged in system dynamics, and he's pursuing what we're calling these three major thrust areas. One is the System Dynamics National Model, and that generates major observed modes of economic behavior. A new management education based on the internet and dynamic complexity of all the related parts of a corporation, and brings them into a unified system. And then finally, system dynamics is a methodology for giving cohesion, meaning, and motivation to pre-college education. I will say that he's really shifted his energy and time over the last several years, excuse me, focusing on this pre-college education. He spends time in high schools and middle schools and elementary schools, trying to stimulate and relay knowledge about system dynamics to children as they're in their very, very early formative stages. And there's some really valuable programs that are put in place now at the high school and the elementary school level. System dynamics is a very active, and live and vibrant activity, a lot of professional interest in it. There is indeed a System Dynamics Society. By the way, I meant to mention this and I failed to when I talked about decision theory and utility theory and also risk analysis. I don't recall Dr. Weiss mentioning that either, and intelligent agents. In all those cases, there are societies and journals out there available to you. And if you have an interest in any of those, I'll be happy to provide the links for you, but you can certainly get them on your own. Just go on the web and Google them, and you'll get all sorts of links. But some of the more active ones right now are in the decision analysis and game theory and risk analysis. And it turns out I'm personally a member of all those societies that subscribe to their journals, and they're very helpful. But System Dynamics, I'm also a member of this, but there is a System Dynamics Society. There's their web page you can get access to. And indeed, we are hosting the next World Conference on System Dynamics in Albuquerque, New Mexico in a little less than a year. And if you have an interest in that, I can get you information on it as well. So what do we mean when we talk about system dynamics? Well, the name is fairly descriptive, self-descriptive. It's a methodology for studying and managing complex feedback systems. These are typical of situations we find ourselves in business and in other social systems. And as you gain this understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about system dynamics, hopefully you begin to see the coupling between system dynamics and many of the concepts that we've introduced, particularly back in Module 1 of this class: complex, adaptive, emergent behavior, intelligent, and wicked systems, all those nice qualifiers. Those systems have indeed been studied with system dynamics tools. And it really is centered on something we think of as feedback dynamics, feedback systems. And indeed, it has been used to a whole host of problems, a whole spectrum of things. And I'm going to expose you to a few of those in the next few lectures. Feedback has been used in all sorts of situations, but it's somewhat different in the way we use it here, and very precise meaning, and has mathematical description. I'll be getting into that during our discussion in chapters 1 through 5, actually all of them, in fact throughout. But you'll be exposed to what we mean by this concept of feedback in a rigorous sense. But generically, what we're talking about, there's a situation of X affecting Y, and Y perhaps in turn affecting X through some chain of causes and effects. That's the feedback dynamics, where we can imagine X influencing Y, Y might influence Z, Z might influence a whole host of other things, but eventually you circle back and X gets impacted again. That's the feedback. That's the closed loop we're talking about. Now, just as we talked about before, breaking things apart and looking at some real small subset of a system can lead to erroneous conclusions and mistakes in decision making. I want to emphasize that again here. We cannot study the link between X and Y and then independently study the link between Y and X and predict how that overall system behavior is going to play out. You have to look holistically at these things. Coming back to that it's going to look a bit like a reductionism, but there's a reverse reductionism lurking in the background here. In order to study this whole system as a feedback system, you need to get an understanding of how that construct's developed, and if we do it properly, that will lead to some correct results, a more correct understanding of the system behavior, which is essential if we're going to have any hope of managing these things. So the methodology in system dynamics is much like the methodology of classical systems engineering, with a few little twists to it. First, there's identify the problem. Then we develop this dynamic hypothesis explaining the cause of the problem. Build a computer simulation model of the system at the root of the problem. Then we would test the model to be certain it produces the behavior in the real world. That's the validation piece. And devise and test the model alternative policies to alleviate the problem. So that's testing different solutions, if you will. So you can begin to see the connection, the relationship between what we're talking about in this straightforward methodology and the methodology in more classical systems engineering. And then it finally implements suggested solutions to it. The other thing that I'll emphasize, and I emphasize this in the classical engineering paradigm as well, yes, we're going to proceed through these steps, but we need to review and refine them, and review and refine the early steps throughout, because it's conceivable, in fact likely, that some of the conclusions we drew when we were identifying the problem, for example, are going to be changed. We may have to restate the problem as we get into developing the hypothesis and building and exercising the simulation model. So keep that in mind. This is a dynamic process, again, just like the classical engineering paradigm, where I had all the feedback dynamics, at least graphically displayed there. You have to continually revisit and revise your assumptions. Early on, Forster and many of his colleagues came up with this notion of limits to growth, and we're going to talk a bit about limit cycles and convergent behavior and so on. But in limits to growth, there are actually documents, paper written on this. That this was a result early on generated back in the, I want to say, early 60s. And what's being shown here is the growth over time that had been observed and then being projected through the 1990s, actually. So there are a lot of subtleties in this diagram, but the most one, I think, let me just highlight a couple of more important ones. You can see the energy demand in the red up there, rising exponentially, essentially. You can see fertilizer demand, the same thing happening. It's in the green. You can see chemicals demand, same thing. The rise in population in billions looks to be not as significant exponentially, but it is indeed a driver for those other exponentially rising curves. So the conclusion drawn from this limits to growth analysis that was done back in the 60s was that there are indeed going to have to be some policies put in place. We cannot sustain exponential growth, and just not doable. So the real issue there is how do you achieve some sort of realistic limiting factors, and relationships need to be derived in order to understand what those limiting factors are and how they really do cause limits to the growth. It led to a lot of controversy. And you can imagine where the controversy was coming from as you think through these conclusions. And there were three. The first conclusion was that in the span of less than 100 years, if we don't have any major change in the physical or the economic or social relationships that have historically and traditionally governed the world development, our society will run out of renewable resources on which all of our industrial base is dependent. And when the resources have been depleted, there's going to be a precipitous collapse of the economic system, and that'll be result in massive unemployment, decreased food production, and an overall decline in population as the death rate soars. And there's no smooth transition, no gradual slowing down of activity. Rather, the economic system consumes successively larger amounts of the depletable resources until they are gone. And the characteristic behavior of the system is overshoot and collapse. And I'm going to show you some a little later in this lecture, or in the next lecture, I'll show you how this phenomenology of overshoot and collapse is not uncommon in a lot of systems. Second conclusion was a piecemeal approach to solving individual problems is not going to be successful. To demonstrate the point, the authors, and Forster and Donald Meadows and so on, the authors arbitrarily double their estimates of the resource base and allow the model to trace out an alternative vision based on the new higher level of resources. And in this alternative vision, the collapse still occurs, but the time is caused by excessive pollution generated by the increased pace of industrialization permitted by the greater availability of resources. So it's just a lazy inevitable, essentially. The authors then suggest that if the depletable resource and pollution problems were somehow jointly solved, population would grow unabated and the availability of food would become the binding constraint. So in the model, the removal of one limit only causes the system to bump sequentially into another one. usually with more dire consequences. So this is back to the point that we made about wicked systems. That being, it's not unusual if we don't consider the system holistically. It's not unusual for the solutions we come up with and try to implement to actually cause problems that are even worse than the original problems. So this holistic perspective is paramount. Third conclusion. Studies suggested that overshooting collapse can be avoided only by an immediate limit on population and pollution, as well as a cessation of economic growth. So you can begin to see why there was such an outcry and an uproar with these conclusions. The portrait painted shows only two possible outcomes: the termination of growth by self-restraint and the conscious policy, and that's an approach that avoids a collapse, or the termination of growth by a collision with the natural limits, resulting in societal collapse. So according to the study, one way or another, growth will cease. And the only issue is whether the conditions under which it ceases will be, acceptably congenial, or they're going to be hostile. So once again, with those kind of conclusions, policymakers and a myriad other people, industrialists and so on, reacted very negatively to the study, and the study got a lot of negative press. And originally, when it came out, and in the years that followed, there was essentially a collapse in the system dynamics community for this reason. Nevertheless, there were a few devotees who hung on to the methodology and continued to develop it and continued to propagate it. Most of these folks were in academic settings back at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They sprung out into other major universities like Cornell. Cornell was and continues to be sort of a hotbed for this kind of work. But this system dynamics is essentially now pervasive throughout the world. They're commercial vendors of software that have really made a big impact globally in decision making by providing the methodology and the associated intellectual capital to make decisions about major national and international issues with the results that come from this. Norway is particularly strong, and Scandinavia countries a particularly strong hold for system dynamics in general. So it's made it being system dynamics as a methodological approach to problem solving has made a very strong comeback. It is prevalent throughout its use throughout the United States government as well. So I've given you a little bit of a background into sort of the history of its coming into being. It ran into early problems early on because of some of these conclusions that people drew from it. In all fairness to system dynamics, there were a host of caveats about assumptions and so on that were in there. Those were largely overlooked by people who were finding fault with the study. Before I leave this finding fault issue, I do want to highlight one particularly strong opponent, if you will, of system dynamics methodology. This is from William Nordhaus. He's an economics faculty member at Yale. He also received a Nobel early on in his work. He was a member of the President's Council on Economic Advisors. He served as a provost at Yale and vice president for finance and administration at Yale. So he has a fair amount of credibility in the academic world and in the federal government world as well. Member of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences, a whole host of accolades for Bill Nordhaus. And I've met the gentleman. He's very thoughtful and insightful, as is Jay Forrester. So let's now pit the economist, Nordhaus, against the engineer, if you will. Forrester, and I'm going to focus now on Nordhaus as an economist, his perception, his critique of system dynamics. He claims first that the dynamic theory put forth in the work represents no advance over early work. Obviously, that's pretty much a slap in the face for a researcher of the ilk of J. Forrester. Nordhaus goes on to say that the basic notion of system dynamics, usually called simultaneous difference or differential equations, has been used extensively in economics and elsewhere for decades. That's true and indeed a fact. And further, in the early renditions of system dynamics, the relationships between those variables, I drew up there before, x and y and z, for example, those relationships were essentially differential equations, still are today. Now, the underlying methodology has been enriched significantly since the early days of system dynamics. Nevertheless, its fundamental underlying structure is based on these difference and differential equations. And by the way, there are, as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of software packages out there that one can use to simulate these things once you get them built. But you can show that essentially all these things can also be represented, at least at some level, with something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, and I've done that on numerous occasions. It can become quite cumbersome, though, so I don't encourage you to do that. The second criticism that Nordhaus had was that the economic theory put forth in the text World Dynamics is a major retrogression from current research in economic growth theory. World Dynamics contains no clear concepts of production, function, consumption, or output, nor is there any discernible method for allocating resources over time or between sectors. Now, this World Dynamics, I'll highlight again, gave rise to those three conclusions that Forrester and others put forth. So those things came under severe attack by the academicians in the academic world, by industrialists, and by senior political policy gurus. The third point is that Forrester's made no effort in World Dynamics to identify any relation between his model and the real world. There's no explicit or apparent reference to data or existing empirical studies. So what Nordhaus is attacking here is the validity or the lack of any validation of the models that were built for World Dynamics. The fourth critique was that the methodology of modeling differs significantly from other studies of economic systems. World Dynamics constructs a world model using assumptions which are intuitively plausible to the author, but without reference to any kind of current knowledge. So he's attacking here the lack of recognition and addressing the coupling between what was the state-of-the-art research in economic theory and what World Dynamics was assuming. So the behavior of this world model is then examined by calculating the dynamic path of variables, whereas most scientists would require empirical validation of either the assumptions or the predictions of the model before declaring its truth content. He says Forrester is apparently content with subjective plausibility. This discrepancy in scientific standards of acceptability is probably what lies behind the dispute about the value of World Dynamics. So he's really attacking Forrester's credibility as a objective researcher here, and attacking the overall assumptions associated with World Dynamics, and thereby denying its value. The fifth is that the prediction of the world's future are highly sensitive to the specification of the model. Simulations given above indicate that if assumptions regarding population, technological change, or substitution are changed, Forrester's model behaves in a dramatically different manner. That's certainly true. There's no disputing that fact. And six, there is some lack of humility toward predicting the future. Can we treat seriously Forrester's or anybody's predictions in economics and social science for the next 130 years. That's what World Dynamics did, by the way. It made predictions 130 years in the future. Nordhaus goes on to say that long-run economic forecasts have generally fared quite poorly. Karl Marx predicted the immersion of the working class under capitalism. Keynes guessed that capital could have not productivity not let me start again. Keynes guessed that capital could not net productivity by the present year, which was 1973 when he wrote these. Galbraith assured us that scarcity is obsolete. And now, without the scantest reference to economic theory or empirical data, Forster predicts that the world's material standard of living will peak in 1990 and then decline. So, overall, it's pretty clear that Nordhaus thought that there was not a whole lot of credence that should be given to Forster's work with world dynamics. Now, Sturman is going to be the textbook for this course, and hopefully you all have a copy of this by now. Business Dynamics, Systems Thinking and Modeling in a Complex World. Sturman was also came out of the same group, MIT. He was actually a student of Forster's, the Meadows, and there have been there's a whole host of folks who have can trace their lineage back to Forster's original work. And I want to go back and say, let me highlight again some of the critique that you saw in the Nordhaus 6 talking points there. They're all valid. They're all worthy, and I wanted to give you a point, sort of point counterpoint. We've got the Forster connection and his claims of the value of the system dynamics approach. Then we have the Nordhaus critique and concerns largely about validation, the validity of the approach. Those both are very viable and appropriate things for you to think about when you move forward with your systems thinking, and if you indeed apply system dynamics to your problem. So I'll just say I'm not in either camp in a sense. I don't believe what Forster originally said was necessarily valid. I don't believe that what Nordhaus said negates the value of system dynamics for all future applications. They're simply precautionary things, and you should be aware of that. So always question your assumption with any model, not just the system dynamics modeling. So in the Sturman book, he has, I think it was 7 parts in his book. The first is what he calls perspective and process, and there are 4 chapters there. That constitutes about the first 100 pages of the text. So he gets into an overview, case studies, system dynamics process, and a tour of a dynamical theory. I'm going to go over those now in the remainder of this lecture with hope of sort of jump-starting you through the system dynamics. This is good background material. I encourage you to take a look at the text and at least skim through the material. The real meat is going to come in Chapter 5, and we'll spend some time on that probably in the next lecture where we get into causal loop diagramming. So with that, let's go into Chapter 1. And this is a good time for a break. Okay, now we're going to jump into Sturman. And again, I encourage you to at least skim through the first 4 chapters in Sturman. It does highlight some very important concepts. I think we've covered, at least peripherally, most of these concepts in the first module and again in the second module. But it's important for you to understand how they relate directly to system dynamics. That's why I want to review those just briefly here. First of all, the context. Context for system dynamics is it's all about change. And change does indeed equal dynamics. Further, change is accelerating. And this is back to the wickedness of systems. Our solutions are often worse than the original problems. So for all these reasons, system dynamics has a role to play. And it has characteristics, first of all, that system dynamics is interdisciplinary. It is really grounded in nonlinear dynamics and feedback control. Hopefully many of you have been exposed to both of those somewhere in your studies at university. But beyond what you've been exposed to as engineers, system dynamics also draws on cognitive and social psychology. It draws on economics and other social sciences. So now you can begin to see the connection between this and what I tried to introduce earlier on and what we're going to be doing in the class project with essentially developing a policy portfolio for managing these neo-Luddite problems. And that's sort of a paradigm for us. Further, system dynamics requires us to work effectively with groups of decision makers. And I mentioned before this notion of group decision making and the impossibility theorem that was introduced by Kenneth Arrow, stating that we really can't do that in a rigorous sense. Nevertheless, we have to do it in a practical sense. So all those things are afoot here. Let's see. Well-recognized property. By applying this whole notion of wickedness, if you will, and this came from Sir Thomas More, he said, and it will fall out as in a complication of diseases that by applying a remedy to one sore, you will provoke another, and that which removes the one ill symptom produces others. Sound familiar? Another one from Robert Burns, the best laid plans, schemes of mice and men often go awry. Another one you've heard of Murphy's Law, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Some of you may remember Pogo out of the comic strips. We've met the enemy and he is us. And then I gave you a quote from Riddle and Weber when we're studying wicked systems. Wicked problems, they have incomplete, contradictory, changing requirements, and solutions to them are often difficult to recognize, such because complex interdependencies. And the second important piece of this is while attempting to solve a wicked problem, the solution of one of its aspects may indeed reveal or create another even more complex problem. So this notion of wickedness is very well recognized, has been for some time. And an example of this, this comes out of the text when you're talking about some policy that were implemented by the Romanian government under Nicolae Ceausescu. He has, in fact, a graphic in here that shows the birth rate in Romania from 66 through 71, and then it picks up again in 71 through 94. He has a birth rate, accrued birth rate, births per year per 1,000 people was very, very low, extremely low, about 15 per 1,000 in the population. And for various reasons, like national pride and ethnic identity, the low birth rate was considered to be a very grave problem by the government of Romania. And so they responded by imposing policies designed to stimulate the birth rate. Policies such as the importation of contraceptive devices was outlawed. Contraceptives wouldn't promote birth rates, so they outlawed them. Propaganda campaigns extolling the virtues of large families and the patriotic duty to have more children. They were all introduced. So those introduced information, education, outreach kind of programs. And you remember when I talked about policy options, that was one of the categories. Some modest tax incentives for larger families. Those were also introduced. Again, back to what I propose you think about for policy options for the class project. One of the categories was fiscal incentives. Well, that falls in that category. So the Ceausescu regime picked up on three of those categories that I've already mentioned to you earlier and hope you think about as you get into your class project. And then most important, abortion that was freely available on demand since 1957 through state healthcare systems was banned in October 1966. So now we're getting into yet another category having to do with enforcement and regulations. So with those four different policies that came out of the Romanian government, they've essentially touched on many of the policy categories I've told you about. Well, the result was immediate and dramatic. The birth rate rose sharply to nearly 40 per 1,000 per year, rivaling those of the fastest growing nations. So you can see that in the graphic, rising in there in the 67 time frame. It just really went up. But if you also look closely, you can see that that graph has started tailing off there in 68. Within months, the birth rate began to fall, and by the end of 1970, only 4 years after the policy was implemented, the birth rate had dropped below 20 per 1,000, close to the low levels seen prior to the intervention. So though the policy continued in force, the birth rate continued to fall, reaching 16 per 1,000 by 1989. And that was about the same low rate they had before they implemented the policy. So what happened? Well, the system responded to the intervention in ways the regime had not anticipated. The people of Romania found ways around the policy. They practiced alternative methods of birth control. They smuggled contraceptive pills and devices in from other countries. Women sought and found back alley abortions. Many of these were unsanitary or botched, and they led to a nearly tripling of the deaths due to complications of abortion from 65 through 67. The number of neonatal deaths rose by more than 300% between 66 and 67, a 20% increase in the infant mortality rate. The result, the policy was rendered completely ineffective almost immediately after implementation. So this is a classic example, if you will, of unintended consequences and a wicked problem. It had an immediate burst of success, but was very short-lived and then tailed off. Okay, what about another policy? This policy was one that actually the U.S. government implemented. It was a fight against inflation in the 1970s. And what we're showing here is the Consumer Price Index for the United States between 68 and 76. In the early 70s, inflation had accelerated, and the Nixon administration felt action had to be taken. So, although Nixon was a conservative and a Republican, he chose to implement wage and price controls. And this policy was expensive. There was a new federal bureaucracy. It was called the Council on Wage and Price Stability, that was created to oversee the controls and enforce the compliance. The wage and price controls were viewed by many in Nixon's own party as verging on socialism, costing Nixon valuable political capital. President Ford, who came along just after Nixon, inherited the program. He launched a campaign complete with a campaign-style button that labeled WIN, W-I-N, for Whip Inflation Now. Few observers expected that WIN buttons would have any effect, and most felt that the inflation would return to its prior rate. But inflation actually accelerated. And until in 1975, the Consumer Price Index had returned to its trajectory. It was on prior to the price control. So it leveled off a little bit there, you can see, between 72 and 74, and then began to accelerate again. In fact, the slope of that accelerating line was even greater than prior to when the controls were implemented. So, There are some examples of policy resistance that are on page 9. I won't read all those to you, but I encourage you to take a look at them. The first one was use of cheaper drugs pushes costs up, not down. Study finds limiting what is prescribed as managed care systems has unintended effect on increasing costs. Results were very clear in that regard. Another one I picked out was deregulation of the U.S. savings and loan industry, designed to save the industry from financial problems, led to a wave of speculation followed by collapse at a cost to the taxpayers in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So lots of examples of policy resistance and these unintended consequences, simply because people implementing the policies and developing did not think holistically enough about the implications and the causal structures and all the feedback dynamics. So there's this in what we call this event-oriented view of the world, where we go into a problem and we have certain goals and a situation in mind. Out of that comes a decision, and out of that comes results. Very, very linear sort of structure here. Well, indeed, it's not at all linear if you think about it. You have definite goals. They influence the decision. The environment gets influenced by those decisions, leading to new decisions. It's not as simple as that. If you look at the bottom of the graphic, you still have the same things at the top. You have the goals, the decisions, the environment. There are side effects, though, that come up that influence the environment, and it's valuable to break the side effects out separately and even list them. And those side effects can lead to other actions by other people, and there are goals of these other agents that come into play. So all the myriad influence, and this is still simplistic, but you begin to see the notion here of why everything from in the Romanian case where they actually got illegal contraceptions, they have other goals that allow them to circumvent the system, not necessarily in a good way. Now let's talk about feedback dynamics a bit more, and what kind of dynamics that get generated by that. There's the classical statement of the system where you have chickens producing eggs and eggs producing chickens. As you can see, as you have more chickens, there's an arrow going up over to eggs with a little plus sign, meaning that the number of eggs increases. So as chickens increase, number of eggs increases. Then there's an arrow coming back into chickens from eggs, and say as eggs increases, number of chickens increase, and so on and so forth. Well, that gives rise to this reinforcing loop, and it's labeled R there, otherwise known as a positive feedback loop. When you have these kind of situations, the dynamics that they generate, which is shown down in the bottom graphic there, is actual exponential growth, unbounded growth. So over time, the number of chickens increases exponentially, the number of eggs increases exponentially. Unlimited growth, not unlike what we saw in the original world dynamics modeling that Forrester showed us. Well, I have to take a little side thing here. You've heard the question before, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, there's now evidence that dinosaurs that preceded the modern-day chicken laid eggs. So from that, I let you draw your own conclusion. This, by the way, has very little to do with system dynamics, albeit you can imagine modeling this too. Just a little side note for you. Okay. Now, what about a negative feedback loop, if you will? Well, we have the other paradigm about chickens crossing roads. And you remember the question, why did the chicken cross a road? We'll get into that in just a moment. But so as the number of chickens grows and goes up, the number of road crossings increases. As the number of road crossings increase, I will submit the number of chickens go down because we do have traffic out, vehicular traffic. They hit the chickens, they kill them, if you will. And so in this structure, we have what's known as a balancing feedback loop or a negative feedback loop. And that's simply the product of the signs on these arrows. So chickens increase, road crossings increase. Road crossings increase, chickens decrease, hence the negative. So this is a negative feedback loop, and it has limiting behavior. And that's shown in the graphic below. So here we have a decay, if you will, on the number of chickens and the number of road crossings. That is exponential in behavior. We can, in fact, introduce other notions about goals of number of chickens we want, and in principle we can increase the traffic to control the number of chickens or decrease the traffic. But in this case, we're just showing it going to zero over time. Chicken crossing the road. Well, you've heard that asked before. George Bush, how would he answer? Well, we don't really care why the chicken crossed the road. We just want to know if the chicken is on our side of the road or not. The chicken is either with us or against us. There's no middle ground. And you've probably heard that phrased a little differently from George, but you get the idea. Al Gore. And you probably remember Al Gore and his work in reinventing government, and people have accused him of taking credit for generating the internet. Well, Al said, I invented the chicken, I invented the road, therefore the chicken crossing the road represents the application of these two different functions of government in a new and reinvented way designed to bring greater services to the American people. Now, George or Al never said he did these things, but you can see the humor, I hope. Ralph Nader, who was a current candidate for president again on the green ticket. Ralph says the chicken's habitat on the original side of the road has been polluted by unchecked industrialist greed. The chicken did not reach the unspoiled habitat on the other side of the road because it was crushed by the wheels of a gas-guzzling SUV. Then what might the Central Intelligence Agency say? They say, we can neither confirm nor deny any involvement in the chicken road crossing incident. What would Saddam Hussein have said? He might have said this was an unprovoked act of rebellion, and we were quite justified in dropping 50 tons of nerve gas on it, the chicken. So those are potential political answers to that question about why the chicken crossed the road. But not everything is political in nature, so I want to share just a few more possible answers with you. Well, let's see. These possible answers come from philosophers and others. Karl Marx, it was historically inevitable. Voltaire, I may not agree with what the chicken did, but I will defend its to the death its right to do it. Captain Kirk from the Starship Enterprise, to boldly go where no chicken has gone before. Colonel Sanders, I missed one. And Dr. Seuss, if you have any children, you might want to relate this. Did the chicken cross the road? Did he cross it with a toad? Yes, the chicken crossed the road, but why it crossed, I've not been told. Now, these are obviously humorous and a bit funny, but they also have some subtlety and some meaning in the context of system dynamics. These are different players, if you will, and players, active players in a system dynamics problem system, influence that system. And so I will submit to you that if you were to draw an influence diagram for the system where a chicken is crossing the road, and I showed a very simplistic one earlier, with these different spins, that system diagram, that influence diagram, can quickly become very complex, confusing, and hard to manage and understand, hence the need for some advanced technologies to get their hands around the complexity and the associated policies. I'm not suggesting we do that for chickens and roads, but nevertheless, it's something in a humorous sense begins to introduce this notion of multiple players and how they might influence system dynamics. Well, in the simplistic sense, and we had those two separate feedback loops. We had chickens in the middle. Number of chickens increases, number of eggs increase, and the number of chickens increase again. On the left-hand side, that's a reinforcing or a growth sort of exponential growth dynamic. On the right-hand side, chickens increasing causes road crossings to increase, which cause chickens to decrease. That's got the balancing effect. So you put those two things together, and you get a behavior that is neither exponentially growing to infinity necessarily, nor exponentially decaying to zero in terms of number of chickens, but is seeking some other middle ground, if you will. Sturman makes a good point about learning being a feedback process, and that's true, I believe. So we're trying to make some decisions. Well, the decisions or influence our real-world environment. We would draw some information out of that real-world environment, get feedback into our decisions, and that's how the cycle continues. Continue to make decisions, influence the world, derive information about those influences, and then revise our decisions. But it's not quite that simple. In the somewhat expanded version, we still have that causal loop in the top part of this diagram, but now we've introduced another set of variables. We have a mental model of the real world. That mental model helps us derive strategies and structures and decision rules from which we can make decisions, and those decisions then are based on those rules plus the information feedback we get out of the real world. Now, one's perception of the real world can really be very helpful, or it can be distorted. This is an example that's taken from, so I can find the reference to this. It's actually taken from a real world situation that I'll describe to you just briefly. The question was posed to some folks about the cycle time being divided into three different intervals. There was a manufacturing lead time, an order fulfillment lead time, and customer acceptance lead time. Order fulfillment, which then required 22 days, occupies more than half the total length of the line, while the manufacturing lead time and required 75 days receives about a fourth of the length. And what this figure reveals is the prominence of order fulfillment operations in the mental models of the people. Remember, I showed the mental models on the previous slide feeding into our policy decisions. Well, it has a profound effect in actually distorting the reality. It comes as no surprise that the members of the team all worked in functions contributing to order fulfillment. There was not a single person at the meeting representing procurement, nor a single supplier representative, nor anyone from accounting, nor a single customer. Until someone pointed out the distortion, the members of the group were as unaware of the illusory character of their image of the supply line as we normally are of the illusory contours our brains project onto data transmitted by our optic nerves. So look carefully at this again. These people actually drew this graphic. Then they labeled it. It's a total of 182 days on there. And the 22 days gives a perception, as you look at this, as being the dominant factor in the supply chain cycle time, when indeed it's the smallest factor. But this was not recognized by the people in the meeting. So mental models can be deceptive. So we now are going to couple our mental model to this information feedback. And again, it's to try to get a sanity check, some reality checks, if you will, into our mental models before we start deriving our strategy and our structure and decision rules, hence the feedback dynamic that's shown in this graphic. So we have the real world with unknown structure, dynamic complexity, time delays, inability to conduct controlled experiments. We have information feedback. That in turn influences our mental models, corrects our misperception of feedback, corrects our unscientific reasoning, our judgmental biases, our defensive routines. That then influences, hopefully with some correction, our strategy structure, and corrects our inability to infer the dynamics from these mental models, and then allows us to make decisions. And so in each of these cases, there's some clear impediments to learning that are out there, and those are listed in each one of those. And in particular, in the decision case, there's implementation failure, there's game playing, there's inconsistency, and there's performance being the goal in and of itself. Okay, here's another thought exercise, and in this particular one, we have a hypothesis test, and this allows me to introduce another notion that Sturman uses throughout his text. He calls these exercises challenges. You can think of them as homework assignments. So here's a homework assignment for you. You're given these 4 cards. Each card has a letter on one side and a number on the other side. And you're asked to determine what's the smallest number of cards you should turn over to test the rule. Here's the rule: that the cards with vowels on one side have even numbers on the reverse. And you want to know which cards they are. So what's the minimum number, and what are they? What are the cards? So that's a thought experiment for you. And I'll just give you a little bit of a hint. It has to do with deductive logic. For those of you who have been exposed to deductive logic, you remember one of the fundamental rules in deduction is if you have a proposition P, and you're claiming that P implies Q, which is a conclusion, then that's a deductive statement. P therefore Q. Well, if that is true, there's another property from deductive logic that says if P then Q, then it's necessarily true that if not Q, then not P. So that's your hint. If you can think about those two things, if P then Q, therefore if not Q then not P, that gives rise to the solution to this challenge. So that's the hypothesis testing you're going to be doing. Vowel on one side, the number on the other. If P then Q, also test if P then not Q. Or let's see what happens if Q is not true. So use that and see if you can come up with the answer to. Okay. So generalizing a bit more in this idealized learning world, we still have the same basic constructs of decision as the real world, but now let's introduce this virtual world where we have a known structure, variable level of complexity, and controlled experiments. That's going to give us hopefully a lot more insight, assuming there's some validity lurking in the background here, about information regarding this real world, the virtual world versus the real world, and helps us build these mental models. But I use the word validity there on purpose. If we create this virtual world and it has no validity, then we have a lot of problems that we're going to have to deal with in out years. Okay, so that concludes Chapter 1, essentially. Again, I encourage you to skim that at least and draw out the highlights from it, but I tried to pick most of what I consider to be the highlights there. Now, in Chapter 2, what we're going to get into are some examples, 3 examples in particular. So let me do that. First, in the automobile leasing example, that can be described and modeled. This model that I'm showing you here is won't get into stocks and flows until we get into chapter 6 in the text. But let me describe to you the system, and I think you can begin to see the structure of this model emerge as I describe it. Let's see. So in this case, we have an automobile leasing strategy. And this all came out of a new way for people to buy cars in this used car superstore. These are national chains like CarMax and AutoNation, where they offer a large selection of clean, low-mileage, late-model cars with warranties and roadside assistance plans and so forth. Well, in 1995, there were some senior managers at General Motors who were concerned about the impact of these superstores on their new car sales. Would they cut into General Motors' core market? Would they force prices down? How could GM respond? So they launched an effort at General Motors to explore these notions in more depth to see if they needed to revise any of their corporate operating policies as a result of this. Well, there was a little research on the used car market available to help them at all, so they had to get into to try to understand the dynamics through these virtual models that I mentioned before, and this is an intent to do that. So they convened dialogue sessions among the various players, and these the dialogue decision process it's a disciplined decision-making process which involves a series of structured dialogues between two groups responsible for reaching a decision and implementing the resulting action plans. This is important throughout because this notion of dialogue and interviews, you're going to have to rely on if you're going to apply this or any other modeling tool. And I'll refer back to the notion of bringing in subject matter experts. These are people who live the system, at least a limited version of the system in their daily operating lives. And they have a wealth of knowledge that you need to tap through some structured dialogues if you're going to effectively model these systems. So the first group was a decision review board that consisted of decision makers who generally represent different functions. What they have in common is the authority to allocate resources, namely people, capital, materials, time, and equipment. The second group, the core team, consisted of those with a stake in the implementation. And so the dialogue between those two groups, which involves sharing and learning for both, took place in 4 sequential stages. It was a framing of the problem, developing alternatives, conducting the analysis, and establishing connection. Well, I won't go through all the details with that, but if you look at this system diagram, which has a causal loop diagramming structure, it has a notion of the stocks and flows, and again, you will be getting into causal loop diagramming in Chapter 5 and the stocks and flows in Chapter 6. But you can see production leading at the top of the diagram, leading to new car inventory, increasing inventory coverage. There's a delay out of inventory coverage back into production, and this notion of delay is extremely important for system characteristics, if you will, and their behavior. There are late model cars on the road. There's an associated inventory of late model cars, and then older cars, and then finally scrap. But associated with that are all these other dynamics. We have used car prices being impacted, the attractiveness of late model cars, and so on. So when they interviewed these different groups and they put together what they consider to be the dynamic couplings of these important variables in stocks and flows, this is a simplified version of the system dynamics that were topologically captured. You can see a number of feedback loops in there, some of which are balancing and some of which are reinforcing. So there is limiting behavior in here. There's also a lot of growth behavior as well. Important dynamic. So it gives you a sense of this very simple model of the automobile market, how it can be very complex in the end and influence decision making. Decision making is not trivial when you start considering all these nonlinear effects and feedback dynamics. They had as a structure in generating some of the numbers that went into these things, a probability table. But what's shown here is a probability of a transition from I to J within each one of these cells. So the case in point here, new car leases leading to 2-year-old used cars. Well, there's clearly a functional relationship between those two. So these probabilistic tables were produced, again, as a result of data collection, but also interviews of folks. Then they showed different, they had the model developed, and they wanted to try different strategies, different policy options, and they had different assumptions. The assumptions are shown here along the rows of this matrix. The economic scenarios being future. Were they going to be in a recession? Are they going to have a stable economic environment? Or are they going to be boom years? And this goes back to a game theory sort of perspective. The competitor lease terms were the 2-year, 3-year, or 4-year leases. Well, what they learned in every case, as you can see from these graphs, that if they had no lease term at all, the expected value was negative. So it was in their best interest to have at least a 2, 3, and in most cases a 4-year year lease term. Now you see some negativity in the recession scenario in the 2-year and 3-year. So the clear policy implication of this graphic is that they should have 4-year lease terms, because in that case their expected net present return is positive. So, point being of all this, they can develop a system dynamics model. They can bring in the potential policy options. They can explore them, and then they can get insights into which policy option is optimal from the corporate side, and if it is in fact and indeed maximizing the net present value as shown in this graphic, it would be a 4-year lease. Another graphic that people find useful, in dealing with a lot of folks in private sector and government, you quickly learn that some of the people don't really resonate well with the network structure, albeit for most people it is instructive. It gives them insights. So another graphic that people use in showing the dynamics is this bathtub. So in this case, we're asking again the question: why do short-term leases make us more vulnerable during a downturn? As you saw in that recession case, well, we have production feeding the stock, we have new car substitutes coming in, and then we have a drain at the bottom with sales, and that's influenced by both the price and the strength of the economy. So if the economy is weak, that drain cannot flow as quickly, and your bathtub may indeed overflow, which is not a good situation. Well, let's see, used car prices from 89 through 99. You can see that there was a significant fluctuation out there in 1997. Things started falling off again. It rose significantly, though, clearly from 90 through 96, and the dynamics here are interesting, I believe. We had a flood of off-lease vehicles that inundated the market in 1997, so used car prices fell significantly. And the data show that the aggregate for all used cars, the drop for late model vehicles was much deeper and was most severe in the segments in which the leasing had grown most rapidly. So as prices fell, fewer customers opted to lease their cars. And the Consumer Banking Association reported that the fraction of vehicles from expiring full-term leases returned to leasers jumped from 29% in 1997 to 39% in 1998. About 3/4 of all leased vehicles returned to leasers incurred losses, and the average loss in 1998 was just under $2,000 per vehicle. That's 220% more than the average for 93. So as it happened, General Motors' early action to help avoid those losses, while other car makers, Ford and Chrysler, themselves faced very huge reconciliation charges, GM dodged that bullet. Profits at Ford Credit Corporation fell $410 million in 97 compared to 96, and that was a 28% drop, and that was due to the losses on off-lease vehicles. At General Motors, the net income from automotive financing operations off-lease vehicles fell only $36 million, which sounds bad, but it was only 4%, while of the overall General Motors profits rose by 6%. So upshot of this story is that General Motors paid attention to this emerging problem, if you will, with CarMaxes and so forth, and they got into the leasing, understanding the leasing business, and rearranged their policies in order to accommodate that emerging dynamic. Therefore, they cut their losses tremendously, while Ford, who did not pay attention to these inherent dynamics, didn't cut their losses, and they experienced some heavy losses. A second example is drawn from project management. In this particular case, you're going to see why the traditional project management tools did not provide a means to quantify the ripple effects that the system dynamics did. So in this particular case, the problem at hand is this had to do with a contract that a company called Ingalls had with the Navy. And in this particular project, this happened back in 1970, Ingalls Shipbuilding in Mississippi won a major contract to build a fleet of 30 new destroyers for the United States Navy. And combined with its 1969 contract for 9 amphibious assault aircraft carriers, Ingalls found itself in the happy position of landing 2 of the largest shipbuilding programs in the world, and look forward to a very healthy sales and profits for years to come. By the mid-70s, however, Ingalls was in deep trouble, facing cost overruns projected to exceed $500 million, with annual sales in the mid-70s of $500 million to $800 million. The overrun was threatened to sink Ingalls and its parent, which was Litton Industries. And adjusted for inflation, the overrun would exceed $1.5 billion in 1999 dollars, probably closer to $2 billion in our money today. Well, both contracts were awarded as total package procurement projects with a firm fixed-price contract structure in which Ingalls was provided only with the performance specifications and was thereafter solely responsible for all system design, detail design, material procurement, planning, testing, and construction. Both programs involved innovative and technically sophisticated new designs. That's critical here. The fact that you had to stay state-of-the-art technically was essentially one of the drivers in causing the overage here. Let's take a break here. So the notion here was to understand the dynamics associated with this production process and the overage, and they resorted again to a system dynamics analysis. What's shown here is, again, I'll refer to this again later, that this is the stocks and flow diagram, that the stocks, for example, the work to be done, the work really done, there was rework to be done, undiscovered work, obsolescence associated again with that technology development, feedback dynamics here, things that were not anticipated by either the Navy or Ingalls when they initially got into this problem. There's also the notion of the external dimension. Side effects for these corrective measures, they led to very vicious cycles. The workforce at Ingalls was really stressed out. They required a lot of overtime. Overtime led to fatigue and burnout. There was a lot of hiring that needed to be done in order to make up for lost work, so that the skill level actually declined because the people they hired were not as skilled as the ones they needed. There were schedule alterations because of work being out of sequence and so on, so that negatively impacted the quality and the productivity. The people were negatively impacted because of the burnout, and well, anyway, it became a very real problem. All these externalities well, they were externalities initially. People hadn't thought about them. This goes back to the point that we discussed back in the first module. Where do you draw the system boundary? What is the external dimension? And what I'll submit to you here in this particular case study, that was not well considered going into this problem. Had they considered it, conceivably they would have been able to manage things much more effectively. The third example is one taken from maintenance, and see, just to give you a brief lead into that, there was a Gulf Coast Regional Manufacturing Services at DuPont, and they were reflecting on the results of an in-house benchmarking study that documented a large gap between DuPont's maintenance record and those of the best practice companies in the global chemicals industry, and DuPont fancied themselves obviously in that crowd. Well, the benchmarking study revealed an apparent paradox. DuPont spent more on maintenance than industry leaders, but got less for it. DuPont had the highest number of maintenance employees per dollar plant value, yet its mechanics worked more overtime. Spare parts inventories were excessive, yet the plants relied heavily on costly expedited procurement of critical components. And most disturbing of all, DuPont spent 10 to 30% more on maintenance per dollar of plant value than the industry leaders, while at the same time overall plant uptime was 10 to 15% lower. Well, many of the people found the results of the benchmarking study to be counterintuitive, because their mental models suggested that equipment quality should suffer and uptime should be low in a company that spends little on maintenance, while spending more on maintenance should yield high-quality equipment and high uptime. So how could DuPont be spending more and getting less? Well, they attempted to approach that again with a system dynamics model, and they found these positive feedback loops out there leading to a reactive maintenance culture rather than a proactive. And that was the root cause of it. It's interesting to see things like reinforced behavior. You see the the R7 label out there, the planning capability and the training and the design improvement and the part quality, and then the reactive culture out there. So let's follow the reactive culture around for a moment. We have a breakdown rate that as breakdown rate increases, the planned maintenance skills and the culture decreases. And as that planned maintenance and skills culture increases, the maintenance quality and productivity increases. As the quality and productivity increases, the effect on the equipment breakdown rate and plant uptime decreases. So following that loop around, we have a positive feedback mechanism that causes this sort of exponential growth behavior. So I won't talk through all of them, but you can imagine what's going on here. It's a very complex set of feedback dynamics that are driving the system for DuPont. Well, they ran, after they built the simulation, they ran several different policy simulations, decisions on it. Well, they had the typical plant under existing policy. They used scheduling to minimize maintenance costs. They minimized costs via a full suite of proactive maintenance policies. And they maximized the plant profit via a full suite of proactive maintenance policies. And interestingly enough, they got the biggest change, the biggest bang for the buck in that third scenario, where they started to become proactive, and they brought in not just minimize but maximize. So they brought in scenario 2 the proactive nature of maintenance policies. That was needed rather than a reactive, but they continued to focus on cost minimization. When indeed, as shown in scenario 3, if they shifted their focus to maximizing profit, so now they brought in the revenue perspective in addition to the proactive maintenance policies, they get a dramatic improvement in the profit per year. So this all turned out to be effective in the end, and by simulating those different scenarios, they can indeed show the cumulative cost savings and accumulated revenues and so on. And that's shown in here in this graphic. They also had a Lima refinery plant that showed improvement by implementing such a policy. This was fairly clear. Well, I'll let you read through it at your leisure. But point being, British Petroleum having these very wide set of responsibilities from everything from drilling to refineries and the plants and so on. They have a whole host of competing objectives they have to manage, but by taking this more holistic look, they can indeed get their hands around these fundamental dynamics and influence them to their benefit. Now, what can we derive out of these various examples? So, well, here's some fundamental principles for you to consider, and hopefully you'll internalize these and bring them to bear on your class project. Well, first we want to develop a model to solve a particular problem, not model the system. So in our Neo-Luddite example, we want to manage, we want to develop a policy portfolio to help improve the dynamics of our interaction with the Neo-Luddites. Don't focus it on it being the model. Don't focus it on the system per se. Pick out a specific problem we're trying to solve and build a model around that. You remember the basic elements of the classical system engineering. We talk about, first of all, defining the problem and designing the solution and so on. Well, what needs to be remembered is that the modeling should be integrated from the very beginning of the project. When we're first defining the problem, let's start the modeling at that point. Now let's also, in the third point, be skeptical about the value of the modeling and continually ask this question of why do we need it being the model. We need to have that discussion at the very start of the project so we can essentially have the compelling urgency, the need to have a model to give us this virtual insight into reality. That hopefully, if we think about validity issues, that virtual insight is going to be very valuable to us. And the fourth and last one here, system dynamics does not stand alone. You have to use other tools and methods as appropriate. And that's why in the class project, I'm insisting that you use at least one other tool that's drawn from our tool set. Go back over those again. We have SOSAT, we have intelligent agents, we have risk analysis, we have decision analysis, we have game theory. We also have other tools that I'm sure you have in your bag of tools, and you're certainly welcome to bring any of those to the party. But if you choose to use system dynamics, which I hope many of you will, you'll have to pick at least one other from that list of 5 that we have for this very reason. It's not in and of itself going to give you the answer. The more these tools that can bring value to the party, the better. we have to focus on implementation from the very start, from the outset. So we're thinking about a policy portfolio for managing the neo-Luddite dynamic. Think ahead about how we're going to implement that. And as a case in point, let me cite the Iraqi campaign. Many people have criticized the current administration because, in their judgment, they didn't think ahead in terms of the end game. So once we had the campaign, many of the folks in the administration, and many others for that matter, were surprised with the level of the resistance and so on that have come from the insurgents. So to the extent you can, try to anticipate those unintended, unexpected consequences and manage them from the outset. Modeling works best as a process of joint inquiry between the client and the consultant. So think of yourself as a consultant when you're building this the systems dynamics model or the other models that you're going to be using. Think of yourself as working with the client. The client in this case, I'll submit, is probably the parties who are engaged in running the government in which the neo-Luddites are engaged. So we have the pro-technologists, for example, on the exam, fighting against the neo-Luddites. I think that was in fifth problem on game theory. Well, you have that same thing here. Who's your customer? Well, let's assume it's the incumbent government, not the neo-Luddites, but the incumbent government. So you're working with that being your client, and trying to deliver a policy portfolio to them that allow them to effectively manage this neo-Luddite threat. This business about black box modeling, let's crawl inside this box and determine just what are the salient variables, what are their dynamics, and so on. And I can't stress enough that validation is important, and it has to be a continuous process. You can walk in with the results and show the folks, but you cannot answer the question about does this model really reflect reality, it's not going to be particularly useful nor accepted by anyone. Another important point is to get a preliminary model working as soon as possible. Keep it very simple. Remember the KISS philosophy. Keep it short and simple. And then begin to add detail as necessary as you get into the analysis. So get one up and running as quickly as you can. If it's a system dynamics model, I've already given you at least a start at an influence diagram. You might want to start with a small piece of that. Say hypothetically, pick out the framing dimension of social movement theory and begin to model that. Add to that perhaps opportunity constraints and then resource mobilization before you get into policies. It is important to get a broad model, a boundary, a lot more important to get that than a lot of detail and narrow problems. So back to the suggestion I just made, start with framing, but recognize that resource mobilization and opportunities and constraints are a very important element. So to stay with framing and continue to refine it and get more and more depth and detail in framing while ignoring resource mobilization and opportunities and constraints, it's going to get you into a bind eventually. So keep it broad, keep it short and simple, and add detail as necessary. This business about using expert modelers, not novices, it goes without saying. Obviously, all of you are novices at this point. You will not be expert modelers at the end of our 3-week segment here. Nevertheless, you will have learned enough that I would encourage you, if you think there's a need for you to further your education in the area of system dynamics or any of these other tools, think about doing that. Think about taking additional course materials before you jump into the abyss of applying some of these tools without knowing enough. That can be very dangerous. And then implementation doesn't end with a single project. These things are all dynamic. You come up with a policy portfolio, you implement it, let's go back to the Neo-Luddite case. This is a single project. You have a class project that's going to be due, but if this were your job, which if you're the incumbent government, you wouldn't view this as the end game. This thing has to be continually revisited, policies revised over time. So it's a living, breathing entity, as all these complex, or many of these complex dynamic systems are. Okay, that concludes the examples.